In this section, we're going to talk about media effects, and it's important first to understand what are they. A mass media effect is a change in an outcome within a person or a social entity that's due to mass media's influence following exposure to a mass media message or series of messages. And there are 6 particular types of media effects. Those are effects on cognitions or our thoughts, effects on attitudes, effects on beliefs, effects on affect or emotion, effects on physiology, and effects on behavior. So let's go through some examples of each. For example, playing violent video games is related to increased aggressive thoughts. In other words, when we play violent video games, that is linked to thinking more violently after we finish playing. In terms of attitudes, research shows that exposure to television programs like The West Wing actually changed people's attitudes about the presidency, and it changed people's attitudes about the sitting president and as well as previously sitting presidents, such that they had more positive views about both Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. Because the presidency is portrayed in a more positive light in The West Wing. It'll be interesting to see how attitudes about the presidency might differ now when there are more popular shows like House of Cards and Scandal, which portray the presidency in a much more negative light. So viewing romantic comedies relates to unrealistic beliefs about marriage, such that people who watch more of this content report planning to marry sooner and have more idealized beliefs about marriage. In terms of affect, people in good moods tend to watch happy media to keep their mood positive. But work indicates that depressed individuals, those that are suffering from depression symptoms, do not watch happy media to relieve themselves from their depressed state. So there are differences in how emotion influences media use, but also how that media use influences affect or emotion following exposure. Violent video game play relates to lower galvanic skin response, so that's our level of sweat on our fingers, while watching real-life violence. And galvanic skin response is a key measure of arousal. So lower skin response indicates desensitization to real-life violence. In other words, when we play violent video games, we become desensitized to real-world violence, and that manifests itself in the fact that we don't sweat as much or are as aroused when we see violence in the real world. And finally, in terms of behavior, television exposure is related to disordered eating behaviors. Surveys over time indicate that exposure to various media content relates to lower body esteem, lower body satisfaction, and greater intentions to engage in disordered eating. But it's very important to remember that these effects do not occur for everyone. Let's focus on this part in the model that I've circled in red. I know it looks scary, but we'll get our way through this. These authors argue that media use and media effects depend on certain susceptibility variables that we all have. These depend on people's disposition, people's developmental level, and people's social context. For example, your personality, a dispositional variable, can influence the media that you use and how you are affected by media. Gender, another dispositional variable, influences media choice and effects too. For example, males tend to use or expose themselves to violent content more often than females, and therefore men are more susceptible to being affected by violent content. Your developmental level also plays a role too. For example, young children don't have the cognitive development necessary to process a lot of adult-directed television or other sorts of content. And so therefore they might be influenced differently from adults. And in fact, they might not watch adult-directed content at all. You can imagine how viewing an episode of Arthur that's much more vivid and animated would be more exciting to a child and more enticing to a child than watching something like NCIS, which is darker and slower paced and maybe even scary. And then finally, the social context that we're in influences potential media effects too. Research demonstrates that watching media alone may result in different effects than when you watch with others. For example, most of the time when you watch alone, you might not laugh at the jokes in a situational comedy, but if you're with a group of people, the chances of you laughing are higher, and as a result, enjoyment also changes. We're going to focus on these differences over the next few lectures as we look at media effects in various contexts. So, the take-home message for today is, individuals and groups can be affected by media in 6 different ways, through their cognitions, their attitudes, their beliefs, their affect, their physiology, and their behaviors. But these effects are not uniform. They don't happen in the same way for every person. Instead, different people are affected differently based on their disposition, their developmental level, and their social context.